Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are hosting today Dr. at-Tikriti from London, founder and director of the Cordoba Foundation and the chairman of Muslim Association of Britain. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. at-Tikriti.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
We are going to hold our today's discussion on the wide range of topics on which Dr. Anas, pertaining to discussions in which Dr. Anas took part during these days in Kuala Lumpur. So I wanted to start from a very general question about what is your opinion about compatibility of Islam and democracy, liberal democracy in particular. Are they compatible, or there is a profound divergence between them?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, thank you very much for being so hospitable and kind in this visit to Kuala Lumpur. I've had the pleasure of exchanging ideas, I think the best way is to put it. Because obviously Malaysia has its own context, and it's a context that has its own unique features, and I think it's important that we realize that most of the things that we believe in, they are affected one way or another by the context within which we live. I, for instance, reside in the United Kingdom, and Muslims live as a minority, and we live in a particular political, socio-economic reality that influences the way that we speak and the way that we act. And the same goes for people here in Malaysia and otherwise. So that's important. We refrain from issuing blanket judgments that will affect supposedly everyone. It's very, very important that we leave particular local context to also shape the way that people think and speak and act. Having said that, I think that the question itself was a question that has been asked for decades now. Is it real that Islam and democracy are compatible? And I think, to be honest, in light of recent events, particularly the Arab Spring and now the sort of retraction of the Arab Spring, I think it's important that we sort of reframe the question, or we reshape it, or in fact we reword it, because to be honest, Muslims have proven time and time again, every single time, that there is a chance of a free and fair and transparent elections anywhere, whether in Muslim countries or elsewhere. Muslims have taken part well, and being quite active. We as Muslims in the UK, for instance, I mean, the discussion about whether Islam and Muslims can operate within a democracy is really an irrelevant question. And even in Muslim countries, such as in Egypt and Tunisia and Morocco and Libya and Yemen and many other countries where the chance of a free and fair and transparent elections have been, we found Muslims actively taking part and more than often winning and achieving quite good results. The question, therefore, we should ask is, Western or liberal democracies, as we wish to call it, is it compatible with the outcomes of these free and fair elections that result in Islamic parties winning? And to be honest, till now the track record shows that actually democratic countries and democratic systems have a problem with the outcomes of these free elections. We saw in 1991 in the case of Algeria how those elections were scuppered simply because in the first round FIS won by an overwhelming majority. We saw how in 2006 the Hamas government that was elected in Palestine was totally undermined by an international isolation, which undermined the whole process and sort of punished the Palestinian people for ever thinking of voting freely. And recently we have the example of Egypt, where again a budding, a teething democratic experience, where we had the very first democratic free elections, bringing out the first civil democratically elected president of Egypt, totally scuppered by a military coup, a bloody military coup that claimed thousands of lives, shut down freedoms and confiscated human rights. Unfortunately supported more or less, tacitly, indirectly or indirectly, by Western governments that proclaim democracy or liberal democracy. So to be honest, I don't think that the question ought to be asked anymore. I think we need to be asking a different kind of question.
So if from this question we pass to the issue of the Islamic State, what's your view of the concept of Islamic State? What is it, and should basically Muslims strive to establish their Islamic State on their soil?
No, Muslims should strive to establish Islamic values and principles. Muslims should strive to establish equality and freedom and justice and transparency. Muslims should strive to rid their realities, wherever they are, whether in Muslim countries or non-Muslim countries, to fight corruption and to create reform on every single level, whether it be social, political, economic, religious, intellectual. We need that kind of struggle. An Islamic State is a byproduct. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it's not really the objective. It's, if you wish, if it does happen, it's a means, it's a tool, it's a vehicle. The greater goal, the greater aspiration is to create a world that is conducive to the best interests of all human beings, regardless of their faith, regardless of their culture, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of what language they speak, the color of their skin. That's the kind of overall objective that Muslims carry, and that is the struggle that they strive for. The concept of the Islamic State, I believe, is reductionist, and it comes at when Muslims invariably, either collectively or in pockets, feel attacked and feel vulnerable, they resort to this idea of an Islamic State, because in a sense it gives that kind of confidence and feeling that Islam is then protected, that Islam will then be practiced freely without any kind of attempt to undermine or influence or impact, when actually Islam was never practiced behind high walls or closed doors. Islam is by nature a religion, a concept, an idea, an ideology, a set of morals and values and ethics that involves interacting with other people, that involves speaking with other people, engaging with new ideas, engaging with other cultures. That's the very nature of Islam. So again, in answering your question, no, the Islamic State isn't an objective, it's a means. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it's absolutely fine. I would rather have a just, free, fair, human rights observing country, regardless of its faith, than have something called an Islamic State or an Islamic country, as we do today, here or there, that claims to be upholding Islamic Sharia, as do some countries here or there, but are failing on every other level, including on human rights, on freedoms, on any kind of reform or development or sustainability or the such. I'd rather have the former than the latter.
So in this regard, what's your point of view on establishing hudud? Because we had recently a number of discussions in here in Malaysia on implementation of hudud based on proposal by Islamic Party, and you also, as I know, you took part in several discussions here in Malaysia. So what's your opinion about is hudud should be implemented? Well,
the problem is that I mean the way in which the whole concept is understood is problematic, because unfortunately we have, as we do widely, we have the term, for instance, Sharia, reduced down to the level of chopping off people's hands. And here again, I mean, the concept of hudud, it's as though it's all about caning people or stoning them or cutting off their hands. I would have far preferred there to be a public debate about how the Islamic references, the Islamic set of values and morals, which I personally advocate that they are to the betterment, and they are the universal values that we all believe in. When we talk about freedom, when we talk about justice, when we talk about equality, these are concepts that everyone understands. I don't need to frame them under an Islamic title or to have necessarily a Muslim face behind them. They are essential to Islam. You can't have Islam without freedom, but I'm pretty sure that everyone wants freedom. You can't have Islam without equality and rights, but I'm pretty sure that everyone wants that. So when I would rather that the proposal being drafted or being tabled is one about establishing Malaysia as a just, free, fair, affluent, prosperous, sustainable society, rather than bring it down to the level of a penal code, which is a very small element, very, you know, one of the smallest chapters of the whole concept of Islamic Sharia, which the rest of the chapters talk about human development, about the love of the environment and the care for the environment, about how we build our security system, how we fend off aggression, how we create an economically viable system, how we create jobs, how we create opportunities, how we achieve equality, how we achieve a system and a construct of responsibility and accountability for the elected leaders and figures and the such. I would have rather that the discussion been had in a different way.
So in this context, because inevitably the issue of the very crucial issue of minorities, ethnical and religious in the first term comes, what's your opinion how they should be comforted, how this equality should be brought for the majority not to oppress with their ideas, concepts of Islamic State or whatever it be? If we pass to Europe, there will be that awkward minaret issue and hijab issue. How to reach this balance to protect minorities and to establish the equality?
Well, I think that unless there is a national narrative, a narrative that everyone feels part of, then forever you will be talking about this majority-minority thing. I mean, the diversity of human societies has become a reality of modern life. People move about. I mean, whether you're talking about, you know, European or American or Latin American or African or Asian countries, we're talking about countries that are now multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-faith. That is the reality, and to varying degrees, but we're talking about societies, the reality of which is that you will always find divergence and diversities within, you know, ethnicities, the ethnic makeup or the religious makeup or the ideological makeup. Whether that becomes a problem or whether it becomes a source of richness and celebration depends on the narrative and the policies pursued. The narrative is one that needs to be developed collectively so that essentially we stop talking about Malays or Chinese and Indians in the minority sense. We start talking about Malaysia that has all these denominations of human beings and constructs, without which Malaysia wouldn't be Malaysia. We need to start talking about Malaysia without its Indians or its Hindus or its Christians. It wouldn't be Malaysia. We need to start adopting a different kind of narrative, and that takes brave, courageous, forward-thinking, broad-minded leaders, religious leaders, intellectual leaders, and political figures that actually propose that kind of narrative. So on a narrative level, it's very, very important. Also, that needs to be followed by the policies. And that's where, for instance, this on the issue of hudud, I think that the timing and maybe the discourse that was attached to it was wrong. Maybe the intentions were good. Maybe the idea itself, the substance was favorable. But I think that the way in which it was proposed, I think it needed and required a lot more consideration. Because essentially people are now have this sort of mistrust with politicians. So they hear them say things which might be good, but unless these are quickly followed by policies that assert the very same principles that are being said, then unfortunately that mistrust will be cemented. So we need also to pursue policies that transcend these divides, that stop dealing with majorities and playing on them because they will win me votes next time round, and sort of seeming to target the minorities because it will instill confidence in the majority. It doesn't work. And if we're looking for the future of a nation that is to be secure, stable, prosperous, then we need to transcend on the level of the narrative as well as on the level of the policies that kind of divisive approach.
You mentioned the leader. What is it about concept of leadership among Muslims? Should the leader necessarily be the most pious among them and having knowledge, religious knowledge in the first turn, or in the leader we are looking for effective manager in the first turn?
Well, it would be good to have all that. I mean, it would be good if we can have a person who is God-fearing, who is righteous, who is, puritanical, if you wish. It would be very good if we can have that. But I think that the main qualification that we need today is wisdom, foresight, is prudence. you could call it effective management if you wish, but I think it goes beyond that. It's about actually understanding the context and dealing with it. It doesn't take a PhD. Sometimes, often PhDs don't know these things. They don't know how to deal with these things. Sometimes it's not necessarily an imam or a scholar. It's not necessarily someone with a high degree. It could be someone with quite average knowledge or certificates or qualifications, but someone who has that kind of foresight, that kind of wisdom. And also today it helps a lot in a world where the media is everything and everything is about publicity and the such. It would be good to have a little bit of charisma. People respond to personalities, to characters, to people whom when they talk they engage. When they talk, and I'm not talking here about being empty, because we have, God knows, around the world political leaders who are extremely charismatic but totally immoral, totally void of any kind of ethics. We're not talking about that. I'm talking about people having a degree of awareness, of prudence, of knowledge, of wisdom and the such. All this molded together. We need someone who comes up with a new set of ideas. We've tried everything. Economically, the world continues to face crisis after crisis after crisis. Human beings, educational system. Every single country, including Malaysia, how many proposals to eradicate illiteracy? How many proposals to spread, education amongst women in rural areas? How many? That hasn't really, gained much momentum. We need to ask questions. Why is that? Why is it that we're still struggling to build a strategic vision for the next 20-25 years on the economic, on the human capacity building level? So I think that we need people to come up with a new set of ideas, outside the box if you wish. We're too bogged down by the fact that the parameters within which we work are too narrow. They're too restrictive. But unfortunately we're told this is what's available, so you need to think within those parameters. I think that we need people who are brave enough with the sufficient kind of foresight to see that they need to transcend those particular parameters.
Okay, you're also here in Malaysia to talk about some topics related to the Arab uprising and its consequences. I wanted to ask your opinion about the changed or updated rhetoric of Islamist movements like Rashid Ghannouchi from An-Nahda, already taking a very soft stand on liberal democracy and its compatibility with Islam. Do you think it's a profound change because the leaders understand the needs of somehow newly born societies after this uprising, or is just a change on the surface and it doesn't bring the real outcome?
It's a very interesting question. I think that there are two parts to this. The first is, you mentioned specifically Rashid al-Ghannouchi. It has to be said that Rashid al-Ghannouchi has been consistent for the past 30-35 years. I mean, everything that he's written about democracy, everything that he's written about the model of the modern Islamic state, and about the plurality of societies, the plurality of ideas, of ideologies and the such, and how to deal with that within the parameters of Islamic values and principles. They have been fairly consistent. They were always, Rashid al-Ghannouchi was always renowned for being, sort of towards the liberal side, the progressive side, if you wish. So when he came to, his party won the elections and came to power, I think that more or less he has stuck by his principles. I mean, he really hasn't changed much. There may be certain tactical issues which at one stage you theorize about, but then when in practice you find that they're not workable, or the time doesn't allow. But on a whole level, the approach, the rhetoric, the discourse hasn't really changed much. The second part which you ask about, I think is extremely important, and that is, you have to take note that the political Islamic movements, whether they be the Muslim Brotherhood, whether they be the Jama'ah Islami in various countries, whether at best, over the past 40, 50, 60 years, at best, they were allowed to operate as opposition parties. Virtually never were they ever put in government, never at all put in government alone, to govern alone. And as a result, the only space they had to develop ideas was the theoretical, i.e. to write books and articles and to have conference debates, but never to actually put those ideas to the test. The Arab Spring allowed for that kind of space to put those ideas to the test. And it's extremely natural that some of those altruistic, puritanical ideals wouldn't be conducive to reality, wouldn't work according to the challenges that they face when they come to power. We found that in the case of Egypt. To a large extent, we also found it in the case of Tunisia, Libya, and other countries. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. In fact, if anything, the thing that we need most is the development and change and reform of our ideas and approaches. The last thing I think that the world needs today are people who are stuck in their ways, having believed in a principle 60 years ago, to still insist on that principle today. I think that would be something that no one would actually believe that is right for everyone. So I don't think that we're seeing a major transformation. I think that the ideals, the principles are more or less the same. What has changed is on a tactical level, as well as some theoretical issues which have, when put to the test, were proven not to be either workable or needed to adapt and grow. And by the way, I mean, the reason why I think it's so dangerous, this anti-Arab Spring movement, is because the working in a real situation rather than sitting behind desks and closed doors and writing ideas, that's the way to make people more adaptable to realities. If you wish, bring them from the extremes to the mainstream, because they will be responding to real life problems. Now that we have seen what's happened in Egypt, the coup and the persecution of the people who were democratically elected, what we will inevitably find is that groups within those elements will become more extreme. They'll say, you know what, we tried it, but it failed. So we'll never try it again. We'll never try democracy again because, see, it failed. They killed it off. So we need to resort to other means. And that is what I fear. And that is the threat that we all now face. And in my proclamation to European and American governments saying that it's extremely dangerous of them to support the coup, because one of the outcomes of this is this: there will be pockets, small pockets maybe, but unfortunately effective pockets, who will come out and say, we abided by the games of the democratic game, the rules, we played by the rules, we did everything that we should, we played clean, and yet it was, it was killed off. So it's never going to work. And all of a sudden we will have a renewal of that old mantra that democracy is haram, democracy doesn't work, that even if it does work, they'll kill you off at some stage. And we will end up with a new generation of new groups who will seek other means other than the democratic channel, and that is what I fear.
Is there any Islamist movement who proved to be able to suggest a clear economic project, the project of economic reform, to let the state to come out from this uprising period and to pass to the routine process?
Well, if we are to believe the accusation leveled against the AK party in Turkey, that it is an Islamist party, then it's an extremely successful model. In fact, the AK government in Turkey proved to be the most successful economic administration across the world in the past 6-7 years, when the world was riding the storms of the economic global crisis. So yes, I mean, I think that we have a model in Turkey, and for a while, maybe 10 years ago in Malaysia and Indonesia, we saw also signs of a potential, a possible economic model that would work and could work. So I think that there is no accusation. I mean, I don't think that political Islam or Islamic parties need to prove themselves to anyone. I think that if we are to be sincere about our survey of the map, we would find that when given the chance and given the space, they have performed well, either in terms of elections, either in terms of sticking to the rules of the democratic game, either in terms of playing when they're in opposition, playing fairly and squarely, campaigning well and the such. Failures happen in every government. I mean, there are democratically elected governments in America and Europe that come and possibly fail economically and socially. So we shouldn't accuse political Islam as a whole simply because we have a bad experience here or there. I mean, that I don't think is fair. I think generally, economically, politically, socially, I think that political parties that belong to the Islamic construct I think that more or less they have proven themselves when given the chance and given the space. But the main thing is that societies need to come to an agreement as to exactly where does Islam play a role in their, within their realities. And I think that the world also needs to come to acknowledge the fact that it can't say one thing and then practice another. It can't say we want democracy, but then when democracy comes, they sort of collude in order to kill it off. They can't say that we want human rights, but only in Ukraine, but not in Egypt. We can't say that we want, problems resolved peacefully, but in one country, but not another. So I think as a human race, as human beings, I think we need to do much, much better.
Okay, and my last question, and probably which has already become a classical one, and I've heard you gave your opinion on that, about the Shia Sunnis schism. What's your opinion, where it comes from, what are the reasons, and how it actually affects the developments in the Middle East in particular?
Any kind of problem, whether it be any kind of divide, I mean, people are different. I mean, my own two children, they're different in terms of preferences and tastes. People are different. They come from different ethnicities, backgrounds, cultures, preferences, political, intellectual, ideological orientations, faiths, religions, creeds, sects. People are different. If I want to make that difference a problem, I can make it a problem. If I want to make this difference a source of richness, I can make it so. It depends on how I deal with these issues. And the same thing goes with Sunnis and Shias. It's irrelevant to go back to 1300 years ago when, the killing of Imam al-Hussein radiallahu anhu, and how that descended into a political schism that then turned into an ideological, then faith and creed diversity. I don't think that's relevant. The fact is that we have Sunnis and we have Shias, as we do have Muslims and non-Muslims, as we have denominations within the Christian faith, as we have denominations within the Jewish faith. We have different denominations. Whether we make those problematic is, I believe, a political issue. And there are certain realities in which this wasn't an issue. People lived side by side, they intermarried, they traded with each other. People didn't even come to see the necessity of asking whether anyone was a Sunni or a Shia. We had those. And people still remember those particular times when they even married from each other and they didn't it wasn't an issue. It wasn't an issue. It was a form of someone else's identity, which wasn't a problem. But now that we have political realities which were constructed upon this very divergence, this very difference, all of a sudden they've become an identifier. And therefore people they see this as a label that either is to their security or to their undermining. And it's become a problem. We've problematized this whole issue. And unfortunately, we have, as I said, ultimately political systems, political structures, countries, if you wish, governments, regimes. We could talk about Saudi Arabia on one side, we can talk about Iran on the other side, we can talk about, but generally speaking, government, political regimes that have found it in their best interest to play on this particular card. The invasion of Iraq and the occupation, the justification was, to save Shiites from Sunnis. So all of a sudden, a society that was living side by side, really not realizing that this was a big issue, all of a sudden it was told that no, actually you have to choose, where are you? And I have statistics about thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not actually millions of families which are constructed from Sunnis and Shias, Arabs and Kurds, Turkmens and Persians. How do you count their children? A father who's a Sunni and a mother who's a Shia, what do their children count as? It's these kinds of issues that unfortunately they sort of give the example of how dangerous playing on these dividing lines is, particularly when it comes to something which is so personal to people, such as their belief or their creed or their ethnicity. I mean, you can't, if I'm an Arab, I can't do anything about it. I was born as an Arab. I was born in a country like Iraq. So if we start this campaign against Arabs, it's like racism. You're persecuting me for something which I had no choice in choosing. So I mean, it's unfortunately something which is quite prominent in today's narrative, and we can't deny that. But it's problematic simply because of the way that the narrative and the policies have driven this particular issue. Had they been driven in a different way, we would have not had this particular title as being a thematic issue of today.
So how to tackle it? Should it be some targeted governmental policy, or maybe some efforts on OIC level?
I'm not going to talk about particular labels or the such. Once again, I'm going to come back to leaders. Because to be honest, I think that now we are in a world that has gone beyond the small entities, even of countries, by the way, even countries. Now we're talking about a different set of entities. We're talking about power dynamics. We're talking about interests. We're talking about coalitions. You know, when you talk about Europe, you're not talking about one country. You're not talking about Spain or France or Germany. You're talking about a collection, various within it, but that entity is a block, and so on. So I think that now we're talking once again about a transcendence of those either nation states or those political regimes which ultimately have political interests. And those political interests will often be built upon the elimination or the undermining of the other. You know, a zero-sum game, that I only win when the other loses. When actually we need to instill another kind of agenda in the human race entirely, and that is that we can all win. I don't need to prosper through the failure of the other, and therefore I make sure that the other falls in order for me to strive. That's zero-sum game needs to end now. And that takes brave leaders amongst, you know, both Sunnis and Shias, you know, whatever problem divide we're talking about, to come up and, you know, transcend that and not play to the population, not try to get the popular vote, but actually be brave and principled. We need a few of those. And with that, you'll find that more and more people will subscribe to that, because ultimately people don't want to live in fear. People, if left to their own means, they're kind. Then, you know, they'd like to be friendly with their neighbors. But it's when that continuously dividing hate speech they hear through the media, they read on the papers, they're told by politicians, that drives them scared, and they say, well, we'd better stay away. So I think that we need, again, I'm going to come back to the issue of the leaders. We need people to transcend those walls as how we have constructed around and amongst ourselves.
Well, it seems to be a bigger project than any of Islamic State or such, but probably more.
Well, the challenges are great, and therefore the solution must be as great. I mean, you can't have a great universal challenge and address it through a very small, you know, means or method. This needs big ideas, courageous people, people who talk to the world, who are charismatic, who are wise, who have the foresight, and have the principle and the courage to actually drive this through.
And it seems to be a real ummatic project because it's boundless, it's universal.
True, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Anas, for this interview.